Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive.
Yeah.
This time, we're going way back,
Oh, yeah.
thousands of years,
Way
to
back.
unpack this fascinating world sacrifices described in the book of Leviticus, chapters 3 through 5.
That's right.
And get this, our sources focus specifically on Christian interpretations of these ancient Jewish rituals.
It's a very unique perspective.
It is.
We're kind of looking at these ancient practices through a modern lens.
Right.
Trying to understand what they meant to the people who lived them.
Right.
What they might reveal to us today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine a society where every single detail of life,
I know.
even something as simple as cooking a meal, has a spiritual dimension to it.
Absolutely.
That's the world we're stepping into.
Yeah.
And within this world, sacrifices weren't just about appeasing a deity.
Right.
They were woven into the very fabric of social life,
Totally.
shaping relationships,
Yeah.
connecting people to something larger than themselves.
Absolutely.
Our sources dive deep into the different types of sacrifices,
Right.
each with its own unique purpose and symbolism.
Yeah.
You have the ola,
Mhm.
the whole burnt offering,
Yep.
which was a complete surrender to God.
The whole thing.
And then you have the minha,
Yeah.
which some scholars see as a kind of loyalty gift,
A gift.
a way of acknowledging God's provision and
Right.
expressing gratitude.
Right.
But perhaps the most intriguing type of sacrifice
Definitely.
is the zeva hashalamin,
Yes.
also known as the communion sacrifice.
Yeah. Okay.
The communion sacrifice.
All right.
Now, that one definitely piqued my curiosity when I was reading through the source material.
I bet.
Why don't you break that one down for us?
Hi.
What made it so unique?
Well, unlike the Ola,
Okay.
where the entire animal was burned on the altar
Right.
with the Zevah HaShalamim, only certain parts were offered to God.
Okay.
The rest was shared in a meal
Right.
between the priest, the offerer, and even God himself.
Wow.
It symbolized a restoration of fellowship, a coming together in peace and unity.
So it was more about sharing than sacrificing in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously an animal was still being sacrificed.
Right.
But there was this emphasis on communion,
It was a meal.
on coming together.
Yeah.
That's so different from how we typically think about sacrifices.
And I know.
It is.
Now, what's even more fascinating
Okay.
is that within this category of communion sacrifices,
Right.
there was one called the Todah,
The Todah.
the Thanksgiving offering.
Okay.
And according to our sources, this particular sacrifice was believed to continue even into the Messianic era.
Hold on. You're telling me that even as other sacrifices faded away,
Yeah.
this idea of a Thanksgiving offering persisted.
Uh-huh.
What does that tell us?
Well, the source points out that this was a rabbinic teaching,
okay.
highlighting the enduring importance of gratitude
Right.
and acknowledging God's blessings.
I see.
But here's where things get really interesting for us.
Okay.
This Thanksgiving offering foreshadows something incredibly significant in Christian tradition. The Eucharist.
Whoa. Okay. That's a connection I wasn't expecting.
I know, right?
So you're saying there's a link between these ancient Jewish sacrifices
Yeah,
and one of the most sacred rituals in Christianity.
absolutely. Think about it.
Okay.
Both the Todah and the Eucharist involve a shared meal.
Okay.
Both emphasize gratitude and communion with God.
Right.
And, of course, both feature bread and wine as central elements.
Right.
It's like a thread running through history, connecting these two faiths in a profound way.
Okay, now I'm really seeing how these sacrifices weren't just isolated rituals.
No.
They were part of a larger story, a story that ultimately leads to Christianity.
Yeah.
But before we get too far ahead of ourselves,
Okay.
we need to talk about another category of sacrifices.
Right.
The expiatory sacrifices.
Yeah.
Specifically the hatat and the asham, which were all about atonement for sin.
Yes.
And this is where things get a bit more complex,
They do.
because the Old Covenant,
Yeah.
as described in Leviticus, primarily dealt with unintentional sins.
Yeah.
Think of them as mistakes, oversights,
Yeah.
what some might call venial sins.
Right.
The intentional sins, what we might consider mortal sins,
Uh-huh.
those were a different matter altogether.
Yeah.
So there was a distinction between different types of sin.
That's right.
How did that play out in terms of the sacrifices?
Well, the source material points out something pretty interesting.
Okay.
The type of animal sacrificed actually depended on your social standing.
Really?
A high priest would offer a bull,
A bull.
while someone less well off might offer a bird.
Wow.
There's a whole system of hierarchy even within the act of seeking atonement.
So even in seeking forgiveness, there were social distinctions.
That's right.
That raises some interesting questions about how these rituals reinforced existing power structures.
It does.
It certainly does.
Yeah.
And it's something worth keeping in mind as we delve deeper into the meaning of these sacrifices
Yeah.
and their connection to Christian beliefs.
Absolutely. Picking up where we left off, you might be wondering about the specifics of those blood rituals.
Yeah.
They were central to the sacrificial system described in Leviticus, and they're key to understanding how these ancient practices connect to Christian beliefs.
Those blood rituals definitely stuck with me. We were talking sprinkling, pouring,
Yeah.
even smearing blood on the horns of the altar.
Right?
Pretty intense imagery. What was the significance of all that?
Well, blood was seen as a powerful symbol of life in ancient cultures.
Right.
It was considered sacred, and the way it was used in these sacrifices reflected a deep understanding of its spiritual potency.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the blood of a sin offering for the high priest was taken into the tabernacle itself,
Really?
the most sacred space.
Wow.
This wasn't just about cleaning up a mess.
Right.
It symbolized a deeper level of purification, cleansing the very heart of the religious community.
So the location of the blood ritual was important too, not just the act itself.
Yeah.
It added another layer of meaning, didn't it?
Yeah. It did.
Mm.
And let's not forget the significance of the number 7.
Oh yeah, the number 7.
Often the blood was sprinkled 7 times, representing completeness and spiritual perfection.
Right. Right.
That number pops up again and again in biblical symbolism, and it emphasizes the thoroughness of the purification ritual.
Okay, so we've got this intricate system of sacrifices with specific rituals and this powerful symbolism of blood.
Uh-huh.
But how does this all translate to the Christian understanding of salvation?
Right.
How does Jesus fit into this picture?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
And it's precisely where things get really fascinating.
Okay.
The source material draws a direct line from the Old Covenant sacrifices to the sacrifice of Jesus,
Okay.
suggesting that they weren't just random rituals,
Right.
but foreshadowed something much greater.
So it's not about replacing one set of rules with another,
No.
but about understanding how the old ways point towards something new and more complete.
Exactly. Think back to the Thanksgiving offering.
Right.
And its connection to the Eucharist.
Uh-huh.
Both emphasize gratitude, communal sharing,
Right.
and a recognition of God's presence.
Okay.
They both point towards this idea of a covenant, a relationship between humanity and the divine.
It's almost like those ancient rituals were setting the stage for a new understanding of God's relationship with humanity.
Yeah.
Like they were paving the way for something bigger to come along.
I think that's a really insightful way to put it,
And remember how we talked about the Old Covenant primarily dealing with unintentional sins?
right?
Well, that raises the question of what happens with intentional sin.
Uh-huh.
Those acts that are deliberate violations of God's law.
Yeah, those are the tough ones.
Right, because if animal sacrifices were only effective for unintentional sins,
Yeah.
then what about the bigger stuff?
Right.
Where does forgiveness come from for those more serious transgressions?
That's where the sacrifice of Jesus takes on a whole new dimension.
Okay.
He becomes the ultimate atonement, bridging the gap that animal sacrifices could never fully address.
So instead of a series of temporary fixes,
Right.
you have this one definitive act that changes everything.
That's the idea. And it's not just about wiping the slate clean.
Uh-huh.
It's about transforming our very nature, enabling us to live in a new kind of relationship with God.
Okay, so we've got these intriguing parallels between the Old Covenant sacrifices
Yeah.
and the sacrifice of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the blood rituals themselves?
Right.
How do they connect to the Christian understanding of salvation?
That's where things get really symbolic.
Okay.
Remember how the blood was sprinkled, poured, and smeared on the horns of the altar?
Uh-huh.
Well, in the Christian tradition, the blood of Christ is seen as a symbol of cleansing and purification.
Okay.
It's the ultimate act of consecration, washing away our sins and making us holy in God's sight.
So even though the physical act of animal sacrifice is no longer part of Christian practice,
Right.
the symbolism of blood and its power to cleanse and purify remains central to the faith.
Absolutely. And think about the location of those blood rituals. Okay.
The blood of the high priest's sin offering was taken into the tabernacle itself, the most sacred space.
Right.
This foreshadows how Jesus, through his sacrifice, enters into the very presence of God, pleading for our forgiveness.
It's like he takes our humanity with him into the divine realm, bridging the gap between heaven and earth. And that idea of bridging the gap of reconciliation seems to be the very heart of the Christian message.
You're exactly right. And it's not just about following a set of rules or performing rituals.
Right.
It's about a radical transformation of our relationship with God made possible through the sacrifice of Jesus.
Okay, so we've gone from these very specific physical rituals in Leviticus to this incredibly profound concept of spiritual transformation in Christianity.
Right.
But I'm still stuck on this idea of the physicality of those ancient sacrifices. The elaborate instructions for the tabernacle, the vestments of the priests, the specific types of animals used. It all seems so deliberate, so intentional. What do you make of that?
That's a great observation. And it brings us to another fascinating point from our source material.
Okay.
The emphasis on the physicality of those Old Covenant rituals suggests that tangible actions played a vital role in connecting with the divine. It wasn't just about what was happening in your heart. It's about expressing your faith through physical actions and engaging with specific spaces and objects.
So even though those specific rituals are no longer practiced in Christianity, the underlying idea that physical actions can have spiritual significance still resonates.
It does.
Yeah.
And it raises some intriguing questions for us today.
Like what?
What role do physical spaces and rituals play in our own spiritual lives? Do we need elaborate ceremonies and sacred objects to connect with God?
Right.
Or can we find that connection in the mundane, the everyday?
That's a good question.
What do you think? That's a really thought-provoking question. And it's one we're going to explore further in the final part of our deep dive. Stay tuned, deep divers. We'll be right back. Welcome back, deep divers. We've been on quite a journey, haven't we? From the intricate details of animal sacrifices to the profound symbolism of blood rituals, we've really dug deep into the world of Leviticus.
We have. And as we wrap up this exploration, I think it's worth circling back to that question we left you with. The question of how physical actions and rituals connect us to the divine. It's something that continues to resonate even thousands of years after those ancient sacrifices were performed.
You know, when I first started reading through the source material, all those detailed instructions in Leviticus felt a bit overwhelming. Even a little bit foreign to me.
Right.
I mean, let's be honest. Most of us don't live in a world where we're constantly thinking about the spiritual implications of every little thing we do.
That's true. But if we step back and look at the bigger picture, we can see something really fascinating.
What's that?
Those seemingly complex rituals reveal a fundamental human truth.
Okay.
We are ritualistic creatures.
Ritualistic creatures.
We crave structure symbolism and tangible ways to connect with something larger than ourselves.
That makes sense. Think about it, even in our modern secular world.
Yeah.
We're surrounded by rituals, everything from our morning coffee routine to celebrating holidays, even the way we greet each other.
Right.
These are all rituals that give shape and meaning to our lives.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's so significant that even in the New Covenant, where the emphasis shifts from external rituals to internal transformation, the element of ritual remains baptism, communion. These are physical acts imbued with deep spiritual significance. They're visible reminders of our faith, connecting us to a community and to a history that stretches back centuries.
So it's not about doing away with rituals altogether, but about recognizing their power and finding the ones that resonate with us. The ones that help us connect to the divine in a way that feels authentic.
Precisely. And that, I think, is the most profound takeaway from our deep dive into Leviticus. Those ancient sacrifices, in all their complexity, point towards a universal human need for connection, for atonement, and for a sense of belonging.
Well, they remind us that the search for meaning often involves both the physical and the spiritual.
Absolutely.
The tangible and the intangible.
Yeah.
And that's something we can all relate to, whether we're religious or not.
Absolutely. And while the specific forms of those rituals may change and evolve over time, the underlying human needs they address remain constant.
They do.
So as you go about your day, I encourage you to pay attention to the rituals in your own life. The big ones and the small ones. What do they reveal about your values, your beliefs, your longing for connection?
That's a great challenge and a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of sacrifices. We hope you've come away with some new insights and maybe even a few questions to ponder. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep seeking those connections that make life meaningful.